Well, the first book I ever wrote was a vampire book. This is back in like 2008. And it's a terrible book because your first book tends to be terrible. But there was a cool idea at the heart of it that I recycled and reused for Empire. In terms of what appeals to me about them, for me personally, they're a really cool exploration in the idea of be careful what you wish for. The idea of perpetual beauty and immortality, living forever, being, depending on the kind of vampire you're talking about, being super strong, super fast, whatever, having all these supernatural abilities. On the surface, that sounds great. When you scratch that surface, you realize the price that you pay for it is absolutely awful. The idea of living forever is actually terrifying to me. The idea that everyone you know and everything you love and everything around you is going to go away and you stay the same. And anyone you fall in love with is going to die, and anything that you build is going to corrode, and anything you love will vanish. That sounds like hell to me. So there's a really cool dichotomy there that superficially it sounds like a really enticing idea, but when you get down to the nitty-gritty of it, it's actually a kind of torment. There's a cool dichotomy in that I find compelling. And that's one of the things that I tried to explore in the Empire trilogy, the idea that nothing lasts forever, that on a long enough timeline, everything kind of goes away. And the idea of forever is actually a terrifying one on every level.
What is up, everybody? You are listening to episode 179 of SFF Addicts. I'm your host for today. You'll notice that I'm not Adrienne M. Gibson. I'm MJ Kuhn. Welcome to your weekly dive into the world of science fiction, fantasy, and writing craft. Joining me this week is my co-host, my fellow Midwestie bestie, the witch to my west, is Greta Kelly. Hi there, Greta. How are you?
I'm good. I'm very excited for this ladies' night episode of SFF Addicts.
Exactly. We were joking that we're unsupervised today. So if you would like to support my lovely friend, Ms. Greta Kelly, you can check out, she has a number of books out, but the one I have handy right here, we've got the #1 book in the Warrior Witch duology, Frozen Crown. She's also got the Queen of Days out, so go snag those to support her. You can also support the absent Adrienne M. Gibson, who will be back in a few weeks, by snagging Mushroom Blues.
And of course, go support MJ and her beautiful kitty cats by checking out Among Thieves and its sequel, Thick as Thieves, out now wherever you buy books.
Wherever books are sold. As well, a quick note for our listeners, you can support SFF Addicts on Patreon. We got a ton of cool extras on there, bonus episodes, author readings, blah, 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 all kinds of stuff. So check the links to help us do what we do here. And don't forget to rate and review the show on your favorite podcast app and subscribe to the FanFiAddict YouTube channel where this and every other episode is available in full video so you can see our smiling faces. And now, welcoming the illustrious, the badass, the oh-so-tall Jay Kristoff, author of Nevernight Chronicles, Lotus Wars, Lifelike, and more, including the Empire of the Vampire Trilogy, which wraps today, when this episode airs, with the newly released Empire of the Dawn. Welcome to the show, Jay. How are you?
I'm good. How you doing? I wasn't aware this was ladies' night, so I'll be down now for it.
We were joking. It's ladies' night, and with featuring Jay Kristoff.
Yeah. I can pull it off.
There you go. We're super excited to have you here on our ladies' night. So let's start with an introduction for any listeners who happen to live under a rock and aren't familiar with you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Sure. I'm an Australian-born science fiction and fantasy author. My first book came out in 2012. I published 18 novels. The latest in my run of kind of grimdark epic fantasy is the Empire of the Vampire series. First part of that came out in 2021. The second part, Empire of the Damned, came out in 2024. I think I'm getting these dates right. And Empire of the Dawn is out today as of this recording. So that's wrapping up the trilogy. But I started in I kind of had one foot in two ponds. I was writing fantasy and I was also writing YA. And over the years, I've kind of drifted more into the fantasy space. And now I primarily write kind of dark, epic fantasy. That's kind of my jam. That started with the Nevernight trilogy and has continued with the Empire trilogy, and will continue with the new one as well.
So excited for everyone else to read these books because we've just been loving them. But before we
Oh,
get into
That
your
is
latest book,
lit.
Before we dig deeper into the episode, a quick word from our sponsor. Prepare for a sci-fi and fantasy adventure, an exciting new anthology where you can travel from distant planets on the edge of space to enchanted worlds filled with magic, featuring stories from over 20 authors. Laugh with plucky thieves, or cry with aging mages. Discover ancient wisdoms, rise above unbeatable odds, and reflect on personal sacrifices. All for Honor. The Honor Special Edition Anthology. Back it on Kickstarter, only for a limited time. And now, enjoy the rest of this episode of SFF Addicts.
we love to explore the nerdy origins of our guests. So please tell us what books, shows, movies, or games really got you hooked onto fantasy.
I mean, it's a cliche, but it was The Hobbit for me. I know that's such a twee answer nowadays.
It's true.
I
Like,
guess
you're forgiven.
type for a reason. Yeah, I think I was probably 8 or 9 when I first discovered it, and we had these things in Australia. I'm not sure you have them in America. Primary school kids, elementary school for you guys, you have these kind of anthologies where they would just basically take a chapter from a whole bunch of kind of great fictional works, and you would read one chapter and then move on to the next book. And one of these books had chapter 5 of The Hobbit, Riddles in the Dark, in it, and I read that in class, and then I ran to the library on the lunch break and asked if they had the book, and that was kind of it. So I can still remember the feeling of opening the page of that book for the first time and seeing that map of Middle Earth on the double page spread, and realizing that I was reading a book about a world that wasn't the world where I lived. And that kind of opened a whole bunch of doors in my mind that have never really gotten closed. So, like I say, I know it's a bit of a stereotype and a little bit cliche, but I guess, he's a stereotype for a reason. We're all in one way, shape, or form standing on the shoulders of Professor Tolkien. It's almost cool to hack on him these days, but a lot of our ideas of fantasy have been shaped by him, or at least his interpretation of the mythologies that came before. So, yeah, I wouldn't be here without him.
I think that's true for
Yeah.
a heck of a lot of people. And it's I completely agree. It is cool these days, right, to rag on Tolkien, but
Yeah.
But I mean, who of us hasn't opened the first pages of a book and seen a map and I'm
Right.
in good hands?
I know.
I mean, I still get that feeling now when I open a fantasy book. I get that feeling now when I open my books. There's something, there's something almost magical about it. I don't like using that word. It doesn't seem to sum up everything that it means. But the idea of being in a place that is not your place, and being shown that tangibly and visibly in the first moments of opening the pages of the book, it's transportative. I guess it's magical. It never gets old for me, and it's amazing that I get to do it in my books now.
Yeah, I love it. Sets the stage for the whole, adventure to come.
Yeah, exactly.
So it is interesting because I know Tolkien, not that Tolkien's books are like, rainbows and sunshine, but they do kind of wrap they follow the hero's journey to an extent, right? And you kind of famously described yourself as not really believing in happy endings. I read
Sure.
that a number of places, and I'm just curious, I'm the same, for the record, so we're not ragging on that. How has this philosophical outlook shaped your approach to storytelling? Have you found that this that really shows up a lot in your work?
Yeah, I mean, what I mean when I say that is that I believe victory should come with a price, and it should be a real one and a tangible one. Victories that aren't purchased dearly are boring to me. And the trilogy that I use to kind of illustrate this point, and I'm not holding him up as Dostoevsky or anything, but the Star Wars trilogy is a really good example of that. The first Star Wars film, like the original I'm talking now, like A New Hope, the victory in that isn't really purchased all that dearly. Luke kind of closes his eyes and pulls the trigger, and the Death Star blows up, and everyone goes home and gets a medal. Except for Chewbacca, which is kind of weird because he was co-pilot of the Millennium Falcon. He was like right fucking there. Why didn't he get a medal? But anyway, the victory at the end of that film, no real price is paid for it. I mean, Luke loses his mentor, but that's kind of a necessary step on the hero's journey. It's a requirement to entry almost. It's expected among the audience. But at the end of Empire Strikes Back, he gets his hand cut off. He finds out that his father is the most evil man in the galaxy. His best friend gets kidnapped, and the rebels lose. Like, the Empire Strikes Back ends on defeat. But that means the victory that they win at the end of Return of the Jedi is that much sweeter because they paid a price to achieve it that they didn't really pay in A New Hope, at least not in the context of A New Hope. If you watch Rogue One and Andor and whatever, you realize there was a lot more going on behind the scenes. But that's kind of the example that I used to illustrate that point. Heroes, the protagonists need to be changed by the journey. They need to pay an actual price for the victory they achieve. The idea that, you can never go home again, that idea that I guess Tolkien again expressed in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, like by the act of saving Middle-earth, Frodo is no longer part of Middle-earth. He can't go back to what he had before. The world isn't the same because he's not the same, because he's been changed irrevocably by the journey into Mordor. So he gives up his life in, a metaphysical sense to save the world around him. He pays a very real and tangible price for that victory. So that's kind of what I mean. Like, then the end of Lord of the Rings isn't happy. Frodo doesn't get to live a happy life in the bucolic Shire. He goes into the West. He essentially dies. So that's kind of the guiding principle that I have when I write as well. My heroes, there's a pact struck between a storyteller and an audience. You kind of know that the good guys are going to win when you pick up a book or you start watching a film. No one wants to watch a movie where the villain wins, unless that's the point of the movie. No one wants to read a book where the antagonist is standing atop a charred pile of the hero's corpses on the last page, laughing maniacally, and then the book ends. You kind of know that the good guys are going to win. That's not the point of the book. It's how they do it and what they pay for it. And I had a really interesting conversation with one of my editors on the Empire series, actually. She was reading a section of Damned. There was a combat scene, and Gabriel was fighting some vampires, and Gabriel's the protagonist, for those of you who haven't read the story. And the framing device of the story is that he is telling the entire trilogy in retrospect. He's a captive in a tower, and he's telling the story of his life. So whenever he's in a physically dangerous situation, the edge is kind of taken off it if you think about it, because he lives, because he's telling the story. He can't have died. It doesn't matter how dire the danger he is in. He obviously makes it out because he's sitting in an armchair telling you all about the fight after the fact. And that really got me thinking about what was at the heart of the story. I actually addressed it in the text. There's a moment where the vampire chronicler who was recording his story interrupts him in the middle of this big dramatic moment and says the exact thing that my editor said to me. And he's like, well, I know you're making this sound really dangerous, but I know you got through it because you're telling me the story. And Gabriel says, but this has never been a story about whether I won or lost. It's about the price I paid for the lie of victory. And that kind of underpins that story and underpins everything that I write. I feel that victory has to be purchased dearly, and that usually results in some sadness at the end of the story. Even though the good guys are probably going to win, they will have paid something tangible and real for that victory. So that's kind of the philosophy expanded. When I it's a pithy way of saying the same thing, that I don't believe in happy endings, but that is a very real and underpinning philosophy for all of my writing. That victory must be bought; it must be paid for.
That rings so true, and it's such a good lesson, I think, for writers, that the idea that your hero is going to have to pay for this in some way or another. But I'm curious, how did you apply that when you were writing YA? Is that something you have to blunt a little bit for a younger audience, or is that something that the younger audiences also kind of need to hear?
Yeah, I didn't intentionally blunt it. No, no, I don't think just because you're writing for a younger audience, you should treat them with kid gloves. Not to pun on it, but no, I think younger readers are capable of accepting hard lessons and reading about hard topics, and living hard lives. So no, that was never a philosophy. Like I say, the good guys always do win, and the tone of the YA stuff that I wrote was probably a little brighter, just by dint of the subject matter that I was dealing with. But no, that wasn't a guiding light for us at all. We didn't try and pull any punches. I can't recall us, when I say us, Amy and me, my co-author, I can't recall us ever writing a moment and then looking at each other and saying, actually, this is too heavy. We can't do this. We have to pull back. We did have one discussion at the end of the Illuminae files. There's kind of the Illuminae files are structured. Each book is about a different couple. And by the end of the third book, all the couples have kind of come together and they're fighting a big grand battle against the antagonist at the end. And I actually wanted to kill a couple of those characters just because that's kind of the way I trend. But Amy made a really good point that we had set a tone in the first book. The kind of big twist and reveal moment in book one is that you think the male protagonist is dead for kind of a third of the book, and you find out that he's actually alive. It was all a ruse, kind of in the final pages of book one. So we had set that kind of tone that even if you think something absolutely awful has happened, it will be okay in the end. So I didn't end up pulling the trigger on all those characters, but the characters do still pay a very real price for the victory that they win. It's maybe not as physical or as bloody as some of the other books that I've written, but no, I don't feel, just because you're writing for younger audiences, I don't feel like you should pull your punches. I think you're doing them a disservice if you do that. Young readers are really smart. I mean, I started reading adult books when I was kind of 10 or 11 years old. So just because somebody is young doesn't mean they can't deal with complex subject matter. I think that's a mistake.
Yeah. I love that. And I think that's critical, for writing for those younger audiences to know, these are smart humans that are just looking for a good story.
And way more media literate than I was at that age. So yeah, definitely. I think you're doing yourself and your story and your readers a disservice if you think that way.
Well, you've written for a number of, we've kind of been dancing around, you've written for YA, you've written for adult, you've written a bunch of different subgenres, assassination schools and space operas and gothic vampire horror, right? Like you've kind of,
It's a mess.
tackled a bunch of really, I mean, it's so cool. This is like personally, like just to like,
It's a dream.
insert myself in this, like,
I don't know if it's great strategic career advice though.
That's kind of what I was gonna like pose to you is, do you think creative reinvention is important for modern authors? Is it just something that you find really fun? Is exploring all these different subgenres? Is it a mix of all of it? Like, just what's your take on that?
I think it is fun. Yeah, definitely. And I think if we're talking career advice for authors that are kind of on a similar track that I was on, I mean, everyone's journey is different and everyone's experience is different. And I would hate to think that my experience is the only way this career can be experienced. But I will say that in my debut group back in 2012, when I was kind of playing in the young adult space, I don't know, there was probably 200 people debuted a YA novel that year. And of those 200 people, there's probably half a dozen of us who still write. And everyone else has kind of gone by the wayside. And of those half dozen that are still writing, most of us now write adult. I don't know if that's causation or correlation or what, but I think there is a logic to that. If you pull in your initial audience and they're teenagers, 13 to 15 years old, let's say, by the time you finish your first trilogy, that 15-year-old is 18. And by the time you finish your next trilogy, they're 21 or 22. You think about the person you were when you were 15 versus the person you are when you were 22. They are night and day. They have almost nothing in common. And the thing that the 15-year-old you liked the 22-year-old you is actively repelled by, because you're a kid and you're an idiot. You think, what was I doing wearing those clothes and listening to that music or whatever? So the idea of aging up your content with your audience, I think there is something to that. I'm not going to tell anyone how to run their career, but I will say I think I did well by growing up my content with my audience. You know, you look at the books that I was writing back in 2015, The Illuminate Files, and to a lesser extent Nevernight. Nevernight had a teenage protagonist as well. So I think the first Nevernight book came out in 2016. So if a 15-year-old girl picked that up and loved Mia, that 15-year-old girl's 25 now. She's a very different person. She's probably got a full-time job. She might be married. She might be thinking about kids, So aging up that content with the readers, I think there is merit to thinking that way. It's certainly not the only way you can do it. I know authors who have stayed in that YA space and they're still doing well. They're rare, but they do it. But yeah, I think there's value in exploring that idea. But I mean, to me, that wasn't intentional. I kind of fell ass backwards into that pattern just because those were the books that I wanted to write. I didn't go into Nevernight strategically thinking, okay, this has got to be a slightly older protagonist because my audience is going to age up when I write it. Mia was just a character that sprang into my head and I wanted to write a story about her. So I think I inadvertently discovered that truth rather than intentionally. But in retrospect, looking back, I think there is some truth to that. And I see a lot of YA authors kind of in their second or third series, they make the switch to adult. Sarah J. Maas is probably the example of that. She started writing YA. And as her audience grew up, she wrote, I think the first series she wrote is 7 books. And she was smart enough to realize, okay, the 13-year-old girl who read Throne of Glass is now a 20-year-old woman. What does she want to read next? And she started Romantasy. I think that's incredibly smart to think about your audience that way. And I think there's some real value to it. But I didn't do it intentionally. I just boxed into that shit. So, yeah.
Well, it's cool, hearing how long your career has been able to last and flourish, because it is obviously a privilege that a lot of authors don't get. But I'm interested in, I'd love to hear more about how the genre has changed since you first broke into the industry, and how you see where Empire the Vampire and the rest of that trilogy fits into the current landscape of fantasy.
Yeah. I mean, grimdark, if you want to call it that, I don't know. I don't even really know what that term means. I prefer the term dark fantasy, but dark fantasy as a concept isn't new. It's been around for a really long time. There's been people doing really well with it for, decades, really. I mean, Game of Thrones, in a sense, is dark fantasy. And that, I mean, when did the first Thrones book came out? In late 90s, I think. So yeah, I'm certainly not doing anything new. I have always been attracted to the idea of anti-heroes and kind of morally grey protagonists, people doing bad things for the right reasons. That's just stickier to me as a reader, and I think naturally you're inclined to write the things that you like to read. I never liked paragons as characters. I always liked, the Han Solos rather than Luke Skywalkers. That's just the way I was wired. So that kind of dictated the path that I took. In terms of where it fits in the overall scheme of fantasy, I admit I don't pay a lot of attention to what other people are doing. And I know you can sound like a bit of a wanker when you say that. But I write the things that I want to read. It doesn't really matter to me what other people are doing or what is doing well. I think chasing trends and paying attention to what is popular is a trap, because particularly in the trad pub space, it moves so slowly that if you're chasing something that's hot now, by the time you write it and it gets edited and finds its way out to a bookshelf, it's probably going to be 2.5 years, 3 years. That trend is probably dead, or at least if not dead, then dying. So paying attention to what the person sitting next to you is doing, I think, is a trap. I think you're better off keeping your eye on your own paper and writing the things that you love. And if you're lucky, the thing that you love will have some resonance with a wider audience. I think that's that's a way to be happier in yourself and your work. And you're kind of trusting to fate that your work will find an audience. But all of us are doing that in one way or another. I think you're far better off doing that than writing something that you may not enjoy as much because you think it's going to be more popular. And like I say, in the trad pub space, at least, it moves so slowly that chasing something that's popular anyway is probably a mistake. But yeah, in terms of the wider landscape, I mean, there's a lot exciting happening in fantasy right now. There's a lot of different authors telling a lot of different stories, and it's great that the space has become kind of way more interesting. But yeah, I'm not really looking at the person sitting next to me and what they're doing in their paper. I kind of do what makes me happy, and I'm very lucky in that sense that I have a pretty loyal readership and they like what I do. I've found a place and kind of carved a reputation for the kind of book that I write. I think you kind of know what you're in for when you pick up a Jay Kristoff novel. I'm very lucky in that sense. So I kind of can afford to just do my own thing and do it the best that I can, and write the things that make me happy rather than the things that I think are going to be popular. But everybody is different in that sense.
Well, let's talk about one of the things that I think readers know they're going to get when they pick up a Jay Kristoff book, which is your prose style. I'm obsessed with your prose. It's it's like the way I describe it is it's beautiful and brutal. Like it's got that like I've described it as like prose that punches me in the face, but like in a really good way.
That's nice. I like that. Put that in the front of the next book. Prose that punches in the face.
My question for you is those really just incredibly like poetic, but in like your prose, does it come to you in the first draft? Does it come to you in revision? Like, what is your general writing process in terms of like how many drafts does it take to dial in that wonderful Jay Kristoff prose?
It depends on what I'm writing at the time. I tend to, first off, I edit as I write. So I start every day's writing session by reading and editing what I wrote the day before. And at the end of the week, I will read everything I wrote that week and edit it again. So usually by the end of the first draft, it's not a first draft. I've probably read it hundreds of times, particularly the beginning. So the drafts that I hand in are pretty clean, but I'm not sure you could realistically call them first draft. But I think I'm most at ease when I'm writing action scenes. I see it's hard to articulate. I'm kind of a visually minded person. I have a visual brain and I see what I'm writing. It's almost like I'm watching a film of the scene and I am transcribing the scene onto paper. And when I'm writing action, I'm as close to flow state as I usually get. I can kind of see the film playing out on the back of my eyelid, and my fingers are just the vessel for those images to be transformed into words. That sounds kind of wanky when I say it, but I get as close to flow as I ever feel when I'm writing action. And so a lot of those weird turns of phrases and maybe the strange sentence structure I do, and kind of long run on paragraphs, and the beat and rhythm that I put into those sequences just comes from kind of being in them insofar as I'm in anything that I write. It's kind of weird. Like the best way I can describe it is my fingers are kind of the vessel for the film that I'm seeing in my head. So if you're reading cool stuff that I wrote during action sequences, I probably wrote that in flow, and I'm not even thinking consciously what I'm writing about. I'm just transcribing it as fast as I can. If it's dialogue, then I've usually rewritten that like 7,000 times because, dialogue for me is the hardest part of it. I track my writing every day. I have a word count tally that I aim for. I try to get 2,000 words a day. And I know if I'm writing an action sequence that day, I'm probably going to be done in like 2-3 hours. If it's a big dialogue heavy scene, it's going to take me all day. There's just a lot more thought required for me. And I know writers for whom the exact opposite is true. When it's two people sitting down and having a chat, that's where they're at their most comfortable. And when it's a massive action sequence with hundreds of moving parts, it's a nightmare for them. So everyone's brain is kind of different. yeah, and I'm most at home when there's a lot of motion on the page. So yeah, as to where it all comes from, yeah, if it's cool prose you're reading and action sequences, I don't know where that comes from. That comes from, somewhere in the back of my brain. But if it's cool dialogue, then yeah, it's just a matter of writing and rewriting and rewriting until it feels right. Writing is revising. That's kind of one of the golden rules that I live by. Yeah, so it depends what I'm writing. Sometimes a cool turn of phrase will just come to me, and I'm walking down the street, I'll have a cool idea, and I just write it down on my phone and try and find a way to fit it into one of my novels later. I'll just think of a cool idea. I have kind of a notes page on my phone where I'll just write down a turn of phrase or an idea that I think is cool enough to explore later. I kind of have a big note scrapbook that I'll consult constantly and see if there's some way I can fit those cool ideas into a scene or a character or a story that I'm trying to tell. So that's valuable as well. I don't really understand how my brain works, but I understand enough to know that if an idea is interesting enough for me to write it down, I'll probably find a use for it later on.
Well, let's talk about cool ideas for a second, because you decided to tackle vampires, which is like a publishing no basically since Twilight came out in the early aughts. What appeals to you about vampires in particular, and what made you decide that you were going to tackle them anew in Empire?
Well, the first book I ever wrote was a vampire book. This is back in like 2008. And it's a terrible book because your first book tends to be terrible. But there was a cool idea at the heart of it that I recycled and reused for Empire. In terms of what appeals to me about them, for me personally, they're a really cool exploration in the idea of be careful what you wish for. The idea of perpetual beauty and immortality, living forever, being, depending on the kind of vampire you're talking about, being super strong, super fast, whatever, having all these supernatural abilities. On the surface, that sounds great. When you scratch that surface, you realize the price that you pay for it is absolutely awful. The idea of living forever is actually terrifying to me. The idea that everyone you know and everything you love and everything around you is going to go away and you stay the same. And anyone you fall in love with is going to die, and anything that you build is going to corrode, and anything you love will vanish. That sounds like hell to me. So there's a really cool dichotomy there that superficially it sounds like a really enticing idea, but when you get down to the nitty gritty of it, it's actually a kind of torment. There's a cool dichotomy in that I find compelling. And that's one of the things that I tried to explore in the Empire trilogy, the idea that nothing lasts forever, that on a long enough timeline, everything kind of goes away. And the idea of forever is actually a terrifying one on every level. So, yeah. But in terms of, I remember watching The Lost Boys when I was, 13 or 14 years old. And I knew that I was a weirdo because as soon as those four vampires walked onto the screen, like the protagonist of that film is a 13-year-old boy. Like he was me. And I'm obviously supposed to go in on this kid, Corey Feldman's character, Sam. Like he's the comic book nerd. He's the one who figures out the vampires are real before the adults do. But as soon as those vampires showed up, I was like, oh, I want to be like those guys. They're dressed all in black and wearing leather jackets. They got cool haircuts. They're riding motorcycles. They were the coolest thing ever. So yeah, there's always been an appeal to me about them as a concept. They're a really interesting monster. They mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. They're, for some people, they're an exploration of power and immortality and perpetual beauty. To some people, they're, kind of objects of desire and exploration of sexuality. They're a multifaceted monster in a way that most of our mythology isn't. And the wonderful thing about them is there's been a bunch of different people with a bunch of different perspectives who've been able to reinterpret them over the years. So they haven't remained static. They're not what they used to be. You look at a lot of the other monsters in our mythos, they're kind of just the same. There's not a lot of interesting takes on them, but vampires have been constantly kind of reinterpreted over the last kind of 30, 40 years, and I'm sure they'll continue to be. So they're a really rich canvas on which to paint. So yeah. They're fun. They're a lot of fun.
I like it. Well, and so one of the things that I find the most, I don't know, interesting. I'm obsessed with the series in general, but the most interesting about the Empire series is just this whole mythos of the Silver Saints and that whole like complication and fascinating world building element kind of added to the vampires and that whole piece. And I think that brings us to talk a little bit about Gabriel de Leon, our main character. I would hazard that he is probably one of your most morally complex protagonists amongst many morally complex characters. I mean, he's simultaneously savior and monster. So speaking to monsters and speaking to that character, what was your process for kind of walking that tightrope between making Gabriel fit that really anti-hero narrative without making him unlikable? Because God, I love Gabriel.
I'm glad. Yeah, it's hard writing a bastard, a lovable bastard. Yeah, interestingly enough, the first scene that I ever wrote when the book was really in its formative stages, the first scene I ever put to paper was the scene in book 1 where he steals the horse right at the start. Like his horse dies or he has to kill it because it gets terribly injured. And he comes across a group of people. He's being chased by a bunch of feral vampires, and he comes across a group of people with a horse, and he steals the horse and leaves them behind to die. Kind of let you know from the get-go that this guy isn't actually a hero. He's not a knight in shining armor. He's a desperate man doing desperate things. In the original version that I wrote of that, the people he stole the horse from were just a family. They were a wife and a husband with 2 kids, and he just cut the horse loose and left them to die. And I realized very quickly, oh no, I'm not writing an anti-hero here. I'm writing a villain. This is terrible. No one's gonna like this fucking guy. So I had to, that kind of set the scene from the get-go that I had to pay really particular attention to his motivations. I had to figure out what was at the core of this guy and etch that in stone and keep that as a through line throughout the entire trilogy, because he does do terrible things. He is a desperate man, and it's a terrible world, and unless you're ruthless, you're probably going to die, and you can't do any good at all if you're dead. But I had to give him kind of a few anchor points, you know, a kind of heart of gold beneath the armor. Otherwise, he would just be a thoroughly reprehensible character. And that's not to say you can't have fun writing a thoroughly reprehensible character, but that wasn't what I wanted Gabe to be. I wanted to be, you know, a lovable bastard. And hopefully the question you were asking throughout that entire first book, because the first book is split into kind of 2 timelines. You've got young teenage Gabe and 32-year-old Gabe. And young teenage Gabe is this kind of hyper-idealistic, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed young man who thinks he can change the world. He thinks he can save it. And 32-year-old Gabe is absolutely faithless and broken and sarcastic and cynical and sees the worst in everyone. And hopefully throughout the course of the novel, you're asking yourself, well, how did this man come from this kid? What happened to this kid to turn him into this guy? But at the heart of him, Gabe is still incredibly loyal to his friends. And he is, you know, he's a family man. He's motivated by caring for the people that he loves. There's a line beyond which he won't cross, and he'll do almost anything for the people that he cares about, even though it might take a long time to get him to care about you. Once you do, he'll move heaven and earth to help you. So there is a really strong backbone, morally speaking, in him of loyalty and love that I think stops him straying into full-on villain territory. Like, once he establishes the relationship with Dior in particular, he'll do anything for that kid. There's, you know, he would tear the sun out of the sky if it meant keeping her safe. So I think that's what stops him being thoroughly unlikable. Hopefully by the end of the first book, you understand why he is the way he is. He's been through some horrible shit. He's got a lot of unresolved trauma, to use modern psychological terms, but he's fundamentally motivated by love. I think at the end of the day, love and loyalty. So I think that's the thing that keeps him likable. You understand why he is the way he is, and you see ultimately he's motivated by good, even if along the way he's doing terrible things. And that tone was kind of set when I wrote that first scene. It's like, oh no, you can't have him just murder like two kids and a husband and a wife. Like these have to be kind of bad people that he tops to get this horse. So you're setting the scene that, yeah, this is an awful world. To stay alive in it, you have to do terrible things, but there is a line beyond which this guy won't go. So that was a really valuable experience. I'm glad I kind of made that mistake and realized it early. Yeah, so I think that's the key, kind of a strong moral backbone beneath the grit and the shit.
It's good to know where the lines are.
Right.
Well, you mentioned earlier that in Empire, it's very unusual because Gabriel's telling his own story, which is not a storytelling device you see very often in literature. So I'd love to hear your take on what inspired you to use that storytelling device. And also, kind of speaking of whether or not the people he left behind was just an innocent family or slight shitheads, do you think Gabriel's actually a trustworthy storyteller? Is he a reliable narrator?
I mean, I can't speak to that because the book is out today. So you find out. I mean, the idea of introducing his sister in book 2 was to start casting the shadow of doubt on the things that he was saying. First and foremost, he's colored by who and what he is. He was kind of religiously indoctrinated. He's been raised to see vampires as this kind of monoculture, this vast darkness. There's nothing good about them. There's nothing redeeming about them. There's nothing complicated about them. They must be stopped, and that's the end. Selene was a way to introduce another facet to them, to think that maybe these things aren't as simplistic as you think, and the way you view them and subsequently the world that they live in could be wrong. But also she just calls him straight out on a couple of just straight up lies that he tells. So hopefully the seeds of that doubt have been planted as to why and how deeply he's lying. I mean, that's all kind of resolves in the third book. In terms of what the inspiration for the text was and that model, that framing device, I mean, the big one was Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. That was kind of one of the guiding styles for this book. There were 3 texts that I really sat down and studied the craft of when I was writing this. The first one being Interview. The second one was Name of the Wind by Pat Rothfuss. And the third one was Blood Song by Anthony Ryan. And all of those books used that device, the idea of a person being interrogated or recording their own personal story to a chronicler. And some of them, like Name of the Wind, for example, the chronicler really isn't a presence in the text. He kind of comes in and asks for Quoth's story, and Quoth starts talking, and then there might be a chapter where they break for lunch and talk to each other, but the chronicler really isn't a presence in the story. It's just Quoth speaking. Whereas in Interview, Daniel is kind of, not constantly, but occasionally he will interrupt Louis and ask for clarification or raise an objection or put his hand up and say, can you flesh that out more? That doesn't make sense. Or why did you do this? That was a really interesting dynamic that I really studied the craft of how Anne did that. And I wanted that to be the same in Empire. I wanted Jean-Francois to be a constant present throughout the text, both to keep reminding you of the framing device, because ultimately the real story that's being told here is what is happening in that room and why Gabriel is in that castle and why he's telling this story. That's the most important part of the story. So I wanted to constantly remind you of that fact. But also Jean-Francois, he can serve as a reader surrogate, when you're telling a story about, something that to you is as natural as breathing. You don't think about explaining it. If you're talking to a layman, they might need you to flesh out the concept more. So Jean-Francois could put his hand up and say, well, what does that mean? Why do you do that? Why was that the way it was? And Gabe can explain to JF and thus the reader in terms of the world building and structure. So that was a really interesting kind of reader surrogate device as well. But also I ended up having immense fun with the interplay between those two characters. Like I was saying earlier, I'm usually not comfortable when it's just 2 people sitting in a room talking to each other. But I have a lot of fun writing Jean-Francois and Gabriel just giving each other shit constantly. Their character dynamic is a lot of fun. But yeah, they were kind of the three books. They were the inspiration, and I owe a lot to all of those authors, in particular Anne. Empire of the Vampire wouldn't exist without interview.
Well, you said you like writing action, and I would argue that every dialogue scene between the two of those is just like a sparring match, just with words instead of swords. So
Good, yeah, they are a lot of fun to write. They have really good vibes.
I like it. Well, we talked a little earlier about that kind of, especially like so in book one. Let's return to that piece where we have early Gabe, who is the starry-eyed youth that is very devout in the beginning, and then we end up with 32-year-old Gabe, who has no faith in anything at all. So we kind of play with this dichotomy a little bit. A profound crisis of faith in a world that is just continually plunging deeper into darkness, right? That's kind of heavy. But how do you handle these like really heavy existential themes without making the reader just like too depressed to keep reading? Because it's still, I would still describe these books ultimately as a fun read in the darkness of them.
That's good. I think one of the things I try to do is make them funny. There was a technique that one of my earlier editors described as the nervous giggle, which is you try and crack a joke when you've ratcheted up the tension in the scene as high as you think it can go, and it needs to go even further. But you don't want to stress your reader out. You give them a nervous giggle. You give them a tiny moment to let out some of that steam and some of that tension before you really dial it up. I've found comedy is a really good way to do that. It's first of all, it's a good way to make a character likable. I think Gabe has a pretty self-deprecating sense of humor. He puts himself down as much as he puts anyone else down. I think that keeps him grounded, and I think if he can make you laugh, you're a little more inclined to like him even when he's doing terrible things. But also it's helping relieve that tension. So even when I'm talking about something as weighty as rationalizing the idea of an omniscient creator in the context of a world where humanity is on its knees and children are being slaughtered, and this fucking guy up there says he loves you and yet he's made this. How do you explain that? Gabe in particular does it in a way that hopefully makes you smile. So that's one of the ways that I use. But also, I try not to be heavy-handed. Those scenes, there are those confrontations. Ultimately, Gabe is a character whose faith is in crisis, and that theme kind of travels throughout all three books. But it's not something that he's constantly complaining about or thinking about or fretting about. I've established this is a man bereft of faith. He believes in God because you can't not, because the evidence of God is all around you. You hold up a holy symbol and vampires run away from it. So the idea that God doesn't exist isn't available to Gabe. He has just decided God's a prick. And that's his idea at the start of the book, and you kind of get a very quick sense of that's who he is, and then he just rolls on and does what he does. There's only a couple of points in the narrative where that point of view is challenged. I tried not to make it omnipresent, even though it informs him as a character very deeply. I didn't want to harp on it. I set down the rules of who he was at the start. I give him a couple of foils throughout the narrative to challenge him, because I think those ideas are worth exploring. And so exploring them in text with people with opposing points of view is really interesting to me. And I think my favorite scene in the whole trilogy is still at the end of the first book, Vampire, where Gabe and Aaron kind of meet up together after 10 years of being apart. And Gabe has become this kind of faithless, hopeless guy. And Aaron, even though he's been through a really rough journey himself, he's still a believer. And Gabe challenges him on it, like, all the terrible things that have happened to you and the people that you love over the course of your life. Your family's dead, your city's gone, you're living on the edge of nowhere, eking out an existence, and you still pray to this motherfucker every Sunday. How do you do that? and Aaron presents a completely contrarian point of view, and explains, I think, one of the themes really at the heart of the trilogy is in what Aaron says to Gabe that day. I think the line is, "It doesn't matter what you believe in, but you have to believe in something." That nihilism and faithlessness is ultimately just a destructive force. It's darkness incarnate. It doesn't matter if you believe in something upstairs, a higher power or whatever, but if you are completely bereft of belief, then you're lost, you're hopeless. So Gabe decides to put his faith in the people around him in saving Dior and making the world a better place. I think that's a really fundamental truth that kind of lies at the heart of the book. But yeah, like I say, even though I'm exploring these dark themes, I try not to make them omnipresent, I guess. I try not to beat readers over the head with it. And I always try and present a contrarian point of view. I don't want to feel like I'm an author on a soapbox who has figured out the way the world works. I don't want to feel like I'm an author with a message. I think there's a lot of authors out there today who start with a message they want to impart rather than a story they want to tell. And I fucking hate that. I can smell it a mile away. So yeah, I don't want to feel like that guy. Hopefully my books make you think, and hopefully they make you see the world a little differently. Hopefully they present ideas that might be different from your own, but I don't want to feel like I'm the guy who hasn't figured it all out, because I most certainly don't. But yeah, I think even when I'm dealing with heavy themes, I try to do it in a measured way. I try to do it sparingly. I don't want to feel like an author on a soapbox.
Well, I think we can safely say that readers have always felt in very good hands when reading this trilogy. And we'll talk more about the art of creating a trilogy in our masterclass with you next week. But I'm curious, what have been some of the highest highs that you've had while writing Empire? And without spoiling anything, what are you most excited for your readers to experience with this next book in the trilogy?
It's very, very strange. I can only describe it as an epiphany. It's really weird. I was at the end of the Damned tour last year. I think it was like April 2024. I met up with a buddy of mine who was on tour in Europe, and we went and lived in a city called Toledo, which is in Spain. It's this beautiful old walled medieval crusader city, and the old city is kind of perfectly intact, and it's this walled enclave. We lived there for a month and just smashed words. It was really cool. You just get away and you turn off the email and you just live in the book. And so every morning I would get up and get my coffee and write until lunchtime, and then I would go for a walk on the walls and kind of explore the city during the day. And I was probably about halfway through the book, kind of reaching a couple of big pinch points. And I was walking on the walls of Toledo one day and I thought of this idea, and it felt like it fell out of the sky and hit me on the head. I hadn't considered it at all. And I kind of dismissed it as too out there and too silly. And by the time I had walked back to the flat along the walls, I started thinking maybe I could pull that off. I should give it a shot. And so I sat and wrote for the next kind of 3 days. And at the end of those 3 days, I knew it was perfect. Like, it completely changed the book and flipped it in a way that I couldn't have anticipated. But I swear it made everything just fall into place. It was like magic. It's never happened to me before. It'll probably never happen again. But it was like I was looking at the jigsaw puzzle of the book, and this idea it didn't solve the puzzle, but it just turned all the pieces so they're oriented the right way. So I could just move them and slot them into place. And writing the rest of that book was like riding a bike downhill. It was the easiest book I've ever written after that idea, which let me know that it was right. But I had no idea it was coming. So I'll be really interested to when readers get to that part of the book. I think it's fucking cool. Like, I know it's right. But one of the things I've learned over the years, I used to be a complete pantser. I would kind of make it up as I went along. I had no real outlining at all on the Nevernight trilogy. I would kind of get up that day and decide what was going to happen and just do it. And I can't believe that the trilogy holds together as well as it does, considering I had no real structural idea. I had a few meta plot ideas, but I had no idea how I was going to execute them. And I started writing the first vampire book that way as well, but those books are so big and so complicated. I was just wandering off into the woods and spending tens of thousands of words in cul-de-sacs that I had to chop. So about a third of the way through writing Vampire, I decided I have to outline this thing. Otherwise, I'm going to be writing a 1,000,000-word book. And I've continued to outline the trilogy ever since. But I like to leave endings a little bit open-ended so the book still has opportunity to surprise me. I'm not prescient enough to see all of it, but I'll lay down a kind of skeletal structure, I guess, a broad brush roadmap. So at least I know the points that I'm driving to. I liken it to I'm driving a car at night and I have the headlights turned off, but I'm aiming towards a city on the horizon and I can see the lights of the city. As long as I keep the car vaguely pointed in that direction, I'll eventually get to the city. I might take a wrong turn here or there, but if I keep those lights in front of me, I'll get there eventually. But yeah, that idea kind of coming out of nowhere and changing the way kind of the whole third act of that book played out. Yeah, like I say, it's never happened to me before, and I'm not sure what greater lessons I'm going to draw from it. I guess in future I'll leave the ending as open-ended as I can. I feel like if you're writing the correct story, the story feels like it has its own momentum. It kind of knows the direction that it wants to go. And if you've lived with these characters long enough and they're real enough in your head, they'll start to behave in ways that you don't necessarily anticipate because they will have a realness to them. They'll have a rightness to them that your conscious brain may not even really be aware of. So yeah, I guess I will try to leave myself as open to new ideas as I can, even though I'm following that rough roadmap. Because yeah, it was an extraordinary experience. So I'm looking forward for people to reading that one. I had no idea it was coming. So if readers have if the author has no idea it's coming, then readers probably won't know that. So it'll be fun.
Oh my gosh. I was already excited for book 3. Now I'm even more excited.
It's cool. It's pretty cool, I got to say. I'm not gonna try and big note my own book too much. When you're promoting the new book, you're supposed to tell everyone that it's the best thing you've ever written just because that's what's the done thing. But I genuinely believe this is the best book that I've ever written. I'll always love Vampire because Vampire was so hard to write. I really felt like I leveled up my skill set on that one. I had never written anything as big or as ambitious, and I will love that book forever. But I think Dawn has it beat. I think it's genuinely a better book. So yeah, it'll be fun to see readers' reactions.
Ugh. Well, speaking of your projects and all your things that are going on with your writer brain, can you tell us what's next for you? Are you working on a new series? Are you expanding on any of your existing worlds? Can you give us a little mini scoop?
So I've sold in 4 books to my publishers. One of them is a standalone and one of them is a trilogy. I'm probably 2/3 the way through the first book of that new trilogy now. And I pitched it as Inglourious Bastards meets Game of Thrones. So it's
damn.
it's a new world. It's got no connective tissue to anything that I've done previously. It's still kind of dark and gritty fantasy, but it's a higher magic setting that I've done before. It's more trad fantasy in that sense. Usually the settings that I write are really low magic. This one's a little more fantastical, but it's still the same kind of vibes. It's terrible people doing ostensibly good things and looking sexy while doing it.
Well, this has been an absolute delight.
Yeah. I think I'm 130,000 words into that one, and it'll probably be like 200 and some odd by the time I'm done. It's a little bit weird. I try and do something a little bit different with every series. So with Empire, I did the illustrations. With Nevernight, I did the footnotes. This one, I'm doing some weird design and typography in the text, just because I maybe get a little bit bored. I'm just doing straight prose. I need to feel like I'm kind of pushing the limit of what I can write and what a book can be. So that, and I'm just getting to that part now. So that's going to make things really interesting. But yeah, I think the plan is that will be out in early 2027. I'm planning to hand it in, I think, Feb next year. I'll lose a little bit of time on the road when I'm on tour, but I'm on track to deliver that kind of Feb next year. So, but we can't tell you titles or anything like that yet.
Well, we'll have to just...
so exciting. Yeah.
Super, super interesting. You already have my attention fully.
Oh, good.
Well, before we completely close out, we always like to get the last 2-part question out of the way. Can you give our listeners and viewers A, a good bit of soundbite writing advice, and B, can you tell us a weird or random fact that you find to be utterly fascinating?
So the writing advice that I give everyone is finish the book. And that sounds simple. It's actually not. It's the hardest thing ever. But there's a billion first chapters out there. Beginnings are really hard, really easy to write. Endings are really hard. And a lot of the times I see people getting bogged down in kind of the middle and the ending of the book. It's because it's not working, because it's bad. The thing that I would say is that's okay. It's okay to be writing something that's not working. It's okay that the book is busted. Finish it and then fix it. You can fix a car that's broken. You can't fix a car that doesn't exist. If you walk out into your driveway and there's nothing to fix, then you walk back inside your house and you do something else. You walk out in your driveway and there's a busted car spread all over your driveway and your lawn, you'll be compelled to pick it up and fix it. So give yourself permission to be bad. Give yourself permission to have a bad day and write a bunch of slop. You can fix a bunch of slop. That's what second drafts are for. That's what third drafts are for. That's what final drafts are for. It's okay if it sucks right now. And that's a really hard lesson to take on board. You know, ask my wife. When my book isn't working, I'm miserable to be around. Like if the book is broken, I feel like I am broken. There's nothing worse than when the story I'm writing isn't working. But I have learned to kind of trust the process and push through those feelings, because I felt like it on every book that I've ever written. And I'm pretty sure every author who's ever written a book has felt like that at some point in the creation of it. It's okay, push through, finish it, and fix it. That's the best advice that I can give. And it sounds simple, but it's actually the hardest thing in the world. And what was the second question? Sorry.
A weird or random fact that you find to be utterly fascinating.
Oh, okay. I've got a good one. So I learned this when I was writing science fiction. A lot of our ideas about sci-fi are based on Hollywood, and Hollywood often get things wrong. They will dramatize. They'll err on the side of drama rather on the side of fact. So there's a trope in Hollywood that's been used. It was used in Alien and a bunch of other films where you're in an airlock and you open the airlock door and everything whooshes out into space. You know, you kind of get sucked out by the vacuum. In actual fact, that doesn't happen at all. And we know this because we've accidentally exposed a couple of people to vacuum inadvertently. I mean, allegedly inadvertently. And there was a guy, I think he was in the 70s. He was part of NASA, and he accidentally got exposed to vacuum in like a sealed containment unit. And he passed out almost immediately. Basically, what happens is all the oxygen in you just gets sucked out of you through every orifice. Make of that what you will. But it's not like you get ripped out by a tornado. It's kind of like a hairdryer being turned on in your face. But this guy said the last thing he felt before he lost consciousness was the saliva on his tongue and the fluid on the surface of his eyes starting to boil. And I don't mean boil. It's not like boiling hot. It's just like bubbling, like kind of like pop rocks in your mouth. And that's because surface of your eyes, because you have fluid on the surface of your eyes, right? But the reason that happens is because of air pressure. When air pressure is drastically reduced, then the boiling point of liquid is also drastically reduced. And so the ambient temperature generated by your body, like in your mouth, is enough to make the saliva in your mouth boil. So if you're ever in a vacuum, that's what you'll feel right before you die.
Boiling to death. That is one of the most metal random facts we've gotten, I think.
Yeah.
Yep.
On brand, Jay. On brand.
You can blame Hank Green for that one. I watched a lot of SciShow Space, so yeah. Blame Mr. Hank Green.
I like it. We will blame
chap, but
Mr.
he's
Green
pretty
for that
dark.
one. Amazing. Well, Jay, thank you so much for chatting with Greta and I today. This
All
is
good.
part 1, so we will be chatting with you soon for part 2. But in the meantime, can you let everyone know where they will find you online?
I'm on Twitter and Instagram and Blue Sky. They're all Mr. Kristoff, MisterKristoff. So I'm where most good books are sold. You'll find me online, but I spend most of my time on Instagram. That's where you'll find me most active.
Excellent. You can also follow SFF Addicts on Instagram, Twitter, Threads, Blue Sky, all that good stuff at SFF Addicts Pod. You can follow me at MJ Kuhn Books, or just find all of my links at mjkuhn.com. You can follow our good friend Adrian at Adrian M. Gibson. Greta, where can people find you?
Yeah, I'm also mostly on Instagram these days, but you can also find me on TikTok and X at Greta K. Kelly, and also find my links on my website at gretakkelly.com.
Awesome. That's it for this episode. Stay tuned for next week for part 2 with Jay for our writing masterclass on planning a trilogy. Until then, keep reading, keep imagining, and we'll see you next time on SFF Addicts.